So thank you all for coming. I think I and all of us Israelis really appreciate it. On the one hand, it's more challenging to do it. But then when I left Ben Gurion Airport yesterday, it was so packed. I was very surprised. It was very packed, not with people leaving Israel for a long time, but just, I think, taking a break, which I think is really necessary in these challenging days. And thank you, Idan, so much for making it such an enormously inspiring break for all of us. And I would also like to thank Idan for general on your immensely inspiring activity in trying to improve the communications between people who are interested in the brain, but that's not what they do for a living, which I guess is most of you, and us, that this is what we do for a living. This is often for us, I think this is what we do. This is what we do. And I think trying to make an actual in-depth communication is wonderful. And it's really both inspiring, pleasurable, and I hope it works nicely. And following this concept, I think about my talk as more of a conversation. Feel free to ask me. Everybody, not yet. Let me talk for a few minutes, and then feel free to have any question either during the talk or afterwards. One more thing I want to say about it, that I have a collaboration with London. It's largely nicely supported by the Gatsby Foundation that Chaim runs, and it helps me collaborate with my colleagues in London, about which I will talk in my talk. But there's something that is attached to it, and whenever I come to London as an Israeli, I'm interrogated at the gate. And they ask me, I need to prove that I'm going to leave soon, and they ask me, what are you coming here for? And when I say, well, I'm a brain scientist, they look at me, very interesting. And that's the end of the conversation. But when I say, I study autism, everybody has a relative that they want to ask me about. And that's the beginning of an interesting conversation, so I can decide whether I want to talk or not. And that's how and that's how my answer goes. So I study autism. Please feel very comfortable asking questions. Also, in following what Idan said, what is my general profession? It's cognitive neuroscience. In a way, it's a relatively recent, several dozen years that there is such a profession. As a teenager, I was kind of hoping there is such a profession, because I was hoping to address this big gap between mind and brain, which is like all these processes, abstract processes, that I think Chaim was to some extent alluding about from a computational perspective. What are the things that are going on in our brain? And then there is the implementation, which are what neuroscientists do. But for me, the most interesting stuff is, how do we bridge these things? We have these units of physical stuff, and then we have all these amazing things that people do. Can we understand something about how these things are related? I will try to address this big question in my talk. What is autism? So autism was first defined less than 100 years ago, about 80 years ago. And it was actually the two, in a way, founders, clinician founders of the field were born in Vienna. So here we are. This is the best place to talk about autism. And the first description was by a person named Leo Kanner, born in Austria. And he talked about a kid, Donald. And that's what he said. Donald was not like another 5-year-old boys. Autism is more common in boys than in girls. I will tell something about it. At least the diagnostics is there's about 4 times boys that are diagnosed compared with girls. It's an open question why this is the case, but it is. So it's not surprising that the first description was about a boy, and that's what he said. Donald was happiest when he was alone, drawing into a shell and living within himself, oblivious to everything around him. That was the description, the first description by Kanner. Interestingly, in much the same time, there was another clinician, also from Vienna, Hans Asperger, who described something related, and surprisingly, they never addressed, well, maybe it's not surprising, but they never addressed each other's work, even though they were in similar regions, related regions at about the same times. Both were founders, and Hans Asperger, who worked in Vienna, published an account, obviously of another person, another child, with many similarities to Kanner autism, but who had, unlike the first boy described by Kanner, had high cognitive skills, he had very good linguistic skills. His linguistic and cognitive skills were like the general population, maybe even higher. But both kids shared some aspects, which are difficulties in making social communications, in gaining friends without support from their family. It's one of the interesting descriptions is like we give questionnaires, self-questionnaires to try to assess. We didn't derive them, we're just using them, what people say about their difficulties. And one of the questions is, do you have friends? And this, I think that some of the results we get describe the difficulties that people with autism have about evaluating the nature of their difficulties, because some people say, yes, we have friends. I have a good friend who comes to my house every Wednesday at 5 in the afternoon, and he spends 2 lovely hours with me. Nobody who's not autistic would describe these relations as friendships. We understand that somebody is paying for this very fixed. We would not, but maybe they are friends. And when I think about it, it brings me to rethink about all the things that I'm used to, because I got used to this is what friendship is about. Maybe I got used to something which is just the typical way we think about it, and they think about it in a different way. But it's not the type of answers that a person without autism would give you when he's asked about it. So these 2 subpopulations, Asperger and general autism, have shared characteristics, which are difficulties in social interaction. They're not very imaginative. They don't tend to have imaginative games. And they have a pattern of repetitive pattern of activities. Often they have hobbies, but the type of hobbies they have are often those that are pretty rigid in the types of information. They like calendars, things that happen. These things do not change. Maybe you require, but you don't need to update the information that you already acquired. So today, both of these types are defined under the same, this is an umbrella, are defined under the same umbrella, which is called autism spectrum disorder. So there's no distinct definition to Asperger, high cognitive and language skills, versus non-Asperger's, because both of these populations, they have difficulties in social communication, difficulties understanding social situation. They tend to have these repetitive behaviors. And then we gradually understand that they have difficulties that are not social in essence. This will be the essence of my talk, are not social. There's something else. Maybe it's cognitive, maybe it's sensory. I will talk about it. And the question of whether these subpopulations really have a common underlying mechanism is largely an open question. In our lab, like most other labs, I'm happy with you there.
I think maybe you should do it because maybe obscure each other. So feel free to, like myself, I'm shifting the chair a little bit to be able to see better.
Am I?
No, you're fine. Just not you, the chair.
Okay.
Yeah. Also speak louder because we can't hear you in the last row. Louder voice.
Yeah, I did hear you. It doesn't make it simple to implement because I speak. This is when I shout.
Shout.
This is when I shout. So I will try. If I don't manage to, just raise your hands to remind me, because I speak. I will try. Okay. Is it good enough now? Yeah. Okay. So the other question I want to address, and this is really another open question, is the prevalence of autism. What is the fraction of the population which has autism? Well, if we look at diagnostics, it had changed it's amazingly, as I said, it was first defined in the 1940s. If you look 50 years later, their prevalence in the population was estimated as less than 1 in 1,000, okay? 1/10 of a percent. But this has increased exponentially, and this is only 2007. Now at 2000, like this, yes. At 2024, they're estimated that 25 in 1,000, this is somewhere between 2 and 5% of the population. So note that in the last 30 years, the estimated number has increased like about 30 times. It's amazing. What's going on?
Okay. You talk about diagnosis. You're not talking about the number of cases.
This is true.
It's just because now we can diagnose.
And following your question, I was quick enough to introduce the next slide.
Sorry.
No, I mean, this is exactly the question we all ask. Is it just an increase in the diagnosis, or is it reflecting a real increase in the world? Of course, these are not mutually exclusive options, and probably both are correct. So, on the one hand, the most fast increasing fraction is the one which we used to call Asperger. That is, people who do not have general cognitive difficulties, but do have huge social communication difficulties, and they're really huge because they have huge difficulties in becoming independent in daily lives. They often keep living with their families. They need, well, most likely it's their mother, most typically it's their mother that sort of takes care of arranging their what they do during the day. They have difficulties in arranging their lives. But when they're taking tests, like, and this is the population that takes part in our experiments, in typical most science, because we are more equipped to study this population. We study them compared to other people who do very similarly in general cognitive tests, in general language tests, and their difficulties seem to be, I will try to convince you that this is not the case, but seems to be uniquely social. And this population is growing very, very quickly. This is the fastest growing subpopulation, mainly because people who have very broad difficulties, nobody really missed this population as having difficulties, because if a child doesn't speak by the age of 3 years, you note it, and maybe you call it this way or you call it this way, but you know the child has developmental delays. It was not going under the radar. But people who have adequate linguistic abilities and still they don't manage to find friends. Often it's not the case that they're not interested, but they're missing what's going on. There's something they fail to figure out, and this is what I will try to explain, or this is what we are trying to explain, not the only people. But I want to say something about your question. Is there a real increase, or we're more sensitive, or maybe we are more strict because social requirements unless, in a way, we think about it as ourselves as more broad, but, you know, to succeed in modern society, you have much more strict needs. For example, I don't know, 60 years ago, you were more likely to be a farmer if you don't want to have online interactions. The proportion of farmers decreases, and sort of in urban society is often less permissive to not being following the general rules, unwritten rules, non-explicit rules of social interactions. Anyhow, one of the famous people who works on autism is Simon, who happens to be the cousin of Sasha, in case you wonder, Simon Baron-Cohen. And Simon Baron-Cohen, he will be a key person in my following slide, but one of the things he suggested is that there's a real increase in the people that we once called Asperger. And why is that? Because females go more into universities. Well, what? Females go into MIT, they go into Caltech, and then they meet people who they marry. And then this is not the kind of marriage that used to be 50 years ago, when these people did not go to universities and did not marry these people. But now we have a gene combination that was not common 50 years ago. And these are women who have this tendency to be engineers, with men who are similar to them in many ways, and then their combined genetics is more likely to yield Asperger-like people. That's the claim by Simon Baron-Cohen. It's an open question. It's an open question, but this is as much as we know now. It's not obvious. There are many people who think that the fraction of people who have difficulties understanding what's going on has increased. Personally, I think it has to do also with reduced social online interactions, because you learn to interact, you learn the unwritten and non-explicitly told rules of communication, and some people are more into it and some people are less. And when you're less experienced and you have other alternatives, you can play with other games that do not involve other people in online interaction, and you gain less experience and you're less proficient. Maybe I will have questions for you at the end of the talk if you don't have questions for me. But basically, it's an open question. Again, both could be correct. It doesn't mean that only one is the answer. What about the genetics, which is a... You didn't ask me about the genetics, but what about the genetics? It's very obvious that autism is largely genetic. Very obvious in the sense that if you have one sibling in the family that is obviously autistic, you can know that the likelihood of other siblings to be diagnosed with autism is much, much higher than the general population. How high? It is a little complicated, depends on other stuff, but it's obviously genetic in this way. Some ways are very clear. There are few gene mutations that are known to be risk genes for autism. But these, when I say few, it's about 100 genes where we know that if you have a mutation, and there are several different mutations with different outcomes potentially in each genes, that when you have them, you're very likely, still not 100%, to have atypical behavior. These are not typically the Asperger. These are more pervasive difficulties, but altogether they form less than 10% than the people who are currently diagnosed with autism. So they are, but it doesn't explain the majority. It's not that the others are not associated with genetics, but this genetics is much more complicated and is not a one-to-one thing, which is not surprising. As we know, the more we know about genetics, we understand that its relation to behavior is more complicated than we thought. One of the most influential theories about what's different in the behavior and consequently, obviously, in the brain, as we assume that behavior is the result of brain structure, of people with autism, is what's called theory of mind. Theory of mind was first studied in the context of apes. And the question was whether gorillas have a theory of mind. In the context of gorillas, often it was the case, do they understand that it's them that they see in the mirror? Okay, and then there was a test that was derived to understand how can you tell if a gorilla, or a kid who's 1 year old, can she tell that she's looking at herself in the mirror? When she sees herself when she's 9 months old in the mirror, it's fantastically interesting, and there's complete synchrony between her movements and the movements on the mirror, but she doesn't realize it's her. When does she realize it's her? So there's a very nice, very simple test to tell it. Anybody? It's exactly. You put let's say something red on your on a person, on a gorilla, or on a young kid's forehead, and you see whether it looks in the mirror something strange. Or so is the first reflex to undo it. It means that you realize that what you see is yourself, and you undo it. And kids do not realize that before 1 year old, but by the time they're 2 years old, they realize it. Gorillas too, but it has to be apes, otherwise they don't. But then there's more sophisticated, as when kids grow up, there is gradual development in what they know about theory of mind. And the main thing about, I think it's a fantastically important concept, I don't think it's that crucial for autism, but I will get to it. But I think it's a crucial concept. For example, so it's the understanding that other people have different representations of the same situation. They have different goals than you. They know different things than you. So you need to hold two separate, at least, representation for what you know, but also a separate representation for what other people know, which may differ from yours. And the most famous example of a theory of mind task is the task which is called the Sally-Ann task. And what is it? So it's called false belief. What is false belief in this case? So here is Sally. Sally has marbles. She has this red thing. She puts the marble into the basket, okay? Sally puts the marble into the basket, and then Sally goes out for a walk. She goes out, she doesn't know what's going on in the room, she doesn't see it, she goes out. Meantime, okay, Anne takes the marble out of this basket, and they're all covered, okay, you cannot see. She takes the marble out of this basket and puts it here. She covers it. Okay, so far. And you, as a child, you see this situation. Then Sally comes back, okay? She had not been part of this situation. Sally comes back. She wants to play with her marble. And then the kid is asked, where will Sally look for the marble? And this is where you need to make a dissociation between what you know, and this is what the marble really is, and what Sally knows is where she left the marble. So in order to be successful, okay, Sally has a false belief that the marble is where she put it. And the question is whether the kid who is asked about it knows that Sally doesn't know. Sally has a false belief about where the marble is. Okay? And kids who are younger than 4 years do not separate between the truth and what Sally knows. They do not separate that. It doesn't mean that they don't have more, in a way, basic forms of, let me show you. So these are two examples.
Okay, this is Sally, and this
it?
is Anne. Which one's Sally? Okay, this is Sally.
Sorry.
And this is Anne. Which one's Sally?
This one.
Well done, right. And Sally has got a basket. And Anne has got a box, nothing in it. And Sally has got a marble. And Sally puts her marble into her basket to keep it safe while she goes outside to play. But while Sally's outside, naughty Anne moves the marble from Sally's basket into her box. Naughty Anne. So where's the marble now?
Box.
Good. Where did Sally put the marble in the beginning?
Basket.
In the basket. Well done. So when Sally comes back from playtime, where will she look for her marble?
In the box.
In the box.
Okay? So this is the failure, and this is an alternative example.
Well, that tricky Anne, guess what she did?
She took it out of mine.
She took the block and put it in the basket. Now, did Sally see Anne move the block?
Because she was outside
That's right.
swinging.
That's right. She didn't see. So when Sally comes back in, where will she think the block is?
In there, but it's not. It's in there.
Okay, so this is a different behavior, but you can see that this kid's understanding that she has false belief about where the marble really is also associated with being much more fluent in verbal description, in sort of explicit description of what's going on. So these are not very, very difficult to separate. General linguistic abilities, and this kid talks but very, very little. Is not fluent in making a sorry,
this is
I'm trying to.
That tricky
Sorry.
Anne.
Okay, so this is one of the main tasks of theory of mind in the brain, and this is called the genre of these tasks is called false belief. Can you understand that the person has a false belief? And one of the, so the same cousin, Baron Cohen, Simon Baron Cohen, sorry, the same Simon Baron Cohen suggested that the greatest difficulty of people with autism is actually they don't have theory of mind. So while typically developing kids can pass the false belief task at about the age of 4, they do not pass it. I will in a minute talk about what do we know about the brain representation of theory of mind. But is this the case? Well, some people with autism have indeed difficulties. Most of the difficulties, if you are very verbal, are with the intuitive parts, and I will show you some examples of theory of mind. So things that you don't tend to retrieve an explicit description of what's going on. You could have had you been asked to, but typically you don't, and you don't understand what's going on. Particularly if you need to do other things while things are going on, you don't do this intuitive theory of mind. So it happens only to part, and it also addresses only sub-parts of what's difficult in the life of autistic people, which I will address in a minute. But I want to say a few things about what we know about the representation of theory in the of mind in the brain. Okay? So it has to do with a basic question. Should there be really mapping between doing that and what is the region in the brain that does this function exactly? We don't really know. But the way we ask these questions kind of assume it is, particularly if we use imaging techniques. So if you do fMRI and you're looking for, if I do this task compared with a task that does not involve theory of mind, and I make a comparison, which regions in the brain are more activated when you have a false alarm situation, I will give you an example, compared to other demanding tasks that do not involve a person thinking about others' state of mind. This is the comparison. It's complex. You need to think about objects, about people, but not about people's state of mind, which is specific, and what are the regions that are activated differently under these conditions. So basically, following this question, one region which was found to be, so this is a lateral view of the brain, this is the medial, I cut in the middle virtually, and I look at the median, the middle brain, and there's 3 parts that were more associated with theory of mind than others. One is this, and it's called initials T, temporal, P for parietal, and J for junction, right? So it's on the junction between the temporal and parietal lobe, this region. This region was described by Rebecca Sachs and Nancy Canwisher. I will describe some things. And it is associated with being activated more when people listen to these Sally Ann-like conditions versus when they ask about what do you think about cars. I will show you in a minute the kind of comparisons they did. But this region is also activated by other conditions that have nothing to do with social. You cannot say it's an exclusively socially oriented region, but it is activated by this kind of tasks. There is a medial frontal region, or this region, that is associated with thinking about others, like when you ask people, what does your friend Rachel think about this situation, would think about this situation compared with you. So if I ask someone who's not you, but to someone who knows you, and so this region will be more activated than when I ask a challenging question that is not to do with your state of mind compared with others. This is also the region. There's also a sensory region, which is this part, I forget the initials, it doesn't matter. A sensory region that is also indicating that you have some representation of others, and this is when somebody does something that is not consistent with what you considered a goal. This is a perceptual event. When he stops and there's no reason, or when he reaches here like me, but there's no cup to reach. So what's going on? There's an activation of this region, and there's a suggests that you have some representation of intention, and the motor activity that you see does not match this intention, so there's inconsistency between intention and, so there's some basic representation, intuitive representation, that is also part of the higher levels of the perceptual system. Basically, these are these parts that were observed. It doesn't mean that we fully understand to what extent they are connected, how processes are being done, but basically these are the regions. I will skip these slides. This is just a description of what I said. This is TPJ. I will just read you one story because I think they are interesting. It's like false belief. I will give you another example. John told Emily that he had a Porsche. Actually, his car was a Ford. Emily doesn't know anything about cars, though, so she believed John. Obviously, it's a false belief that is based on her ignorance. When Emily sees John's car, she thinks it is a Porsche. I hope Emily knows that Porsche is a fancy car, but she doesn't know how to identify. So she has a false belief. When you hear this story compared to another story that is false belief, but about a picture, and it's not about a state of mind, like a photograph was taken of an apple hanging on a tree. The film took half an hour to develop. Then there was a wind that blew out this apple. So where is the apple? The developed photograph shows an apple on the, so the apple is not on the branch anymore. But this will not introduce a theory of mind, even though you have to do some similar operation, and presumably, so what they found is that this kind of stories does not activate the TPJ region. Okay, so basically, yeah.
Just so I understand, when you say somebody who cannot represent the reality of somebody else, does it have a link?
It's a very good question. Yes and no. Because empathy is also about your relations with others, but empathy is like when you realize that somebody else is in pain, do you feel pain as well? And this is something that typically is there in the autistic people. They have empathy, but they don't always realize what exactly is the emotional situation that a person is with. So like, it wouldn't be very refined, for example. They can tell that if you're in pain, they're sad with you. If you're very happy, it's very obvious, they'll be happy with you. But if these are refined situations and they do not exactly understand your state of mind, they're not empathic, not because they can't be empathic, but because they do not understand and separately represent the unique and detailed situation of another person.
You are describing, do they apply equally to the children of the autists who come from a gene mutation, which is said, I think, with about 10% of the autistic people? So do you have the same observation, and when you study your subjects, do you know whether the autism is of genetic origin or not?
So, most of the cases that are an outcome of one of these known genes, these known genes are what's called conserved genes. That means that in the general populations, they hardly have any mutations. And the reason is that they're very essential genes. So if you have, and not all genes are equally important, particularly if they play part in the development, they're more expressed during development. So the majority of people whose mutations can be allocated have more severe autism. Most of them are not those that we study. Because their behavioral phenotype is broader than that of our participants, than that of people who used to be termed Asperger. But they're still with high genetic risk, but we cannot allocate, there's not a one-to-one relation between the type of gene that we know is impaired and their phenotypic manifestation.
So what do you learn from the difference
Between?
those who are from the gene and those who are not?
So first, it's all genetic. The question is how complex is the relation between the genetic atypicality or mutation and the behavior. There are these 100 risk genes that we as a whole community can now screen them in pre-birth genetic screening. And then if you have a mutation in this screen, you're likely to have a child with difficulties. So we learn that you're likely to have, you're not 100% to have, because whether or not the phenotype will really be determined by this gene depends on the rest of your genes in ways that we still don't understand, because they're much more complex. Also, there are a whole genome that is kind of more likely to be associated with difficulties, but for the vast majority of Asperger, if they're mild Asperger, there's no clear pre-birth way to tell. I'm not sure that the deficit is all that severe in order, and I will address what I think is the deficit and how it can be addressed if I get to it, okay? Okay, so let me just say, so what is typical in adults? This is one interesting clip that I think helps understanding.
Hi, Doc.
Hi there, Susan.
And how are you this morning?
Well, my allergies are acting up a bit, but at least I have a good antihistamine to fight it. Dr. Sinclair gave me the prescription. He's a very good allergist.
I see.
I also had a very nice, relaxing drive into the hospital this morning. I listened to my new Herbie Hancock CD. He's quite an outstanding musician.
I see.
And how are you?
I'm doing well. So what brings you to our floor?
The elevator.
Oh. But why?
Because I pushed the button.
Button? What button?
The button in the elevator with the number 9 on it.
But why did you do that?
You mean, push the button?
Yes.
So I could come up here to the 9th floor.
Okay. Let's try this another way. What motivated you to come up here?
I had some news to give you.
Okay, good, now we're getting somewhere.
We are?
Yes.
It looks to me like we're just standing still right here in your reception area.
I mean, figuratively. We are making progress in our conversation.
Oh. In that case, I think I agree. So what was the question again?
Why did you come up here to our floor?
Because the elevator carried me.
I think we covered that already.
Yes. Now that you mention it, I think we did. I think we're having trouble with the communication barrier posed by my Asperger's syndrome.
I have to agree. So I'll do this very carefully this time.
Okay, good idea.
What was the news that you had that led you to decide to come up here and visit us?
Oh. Of course. I should have realized that that was what you were asking in the first place.
And what's the answer?
The answer to the question you just asked?
Yes.
I forgot.
You know, Doc, if I didn't know that you had an IQ of 173, I'd really wonder about you.
Tell me about it.
So I think after we discussed theory of mind, one way to explain this sort of very literal answer is, well, it seems like this person does not have or does not hold, does not actively produce in any automatic way a theory of mind of what the person who's asking him wants to know. Because if he had this separate representation of this person standing there who's, well, what does she do there? She's not very interested. Her job is not to answer how elevators work, what you do to get them work, but to understand what his situation is. But it doesn't seem to be holding a separate representation. This is one manifestation, and now I have, but also there are other manifestations of autism, and I have not that much, but a few minutes to talk about my research. I will give you a summary of what, in its best, I aim to say. In its best, I'm coming from a non-social perspective. We study very simple tasks in the lab. We use computational methods. We use neuronal methods to understand what's going on in the brain in a very different, simplified situation, and ask whether we can come up with a very simple, the simplest that we can, mechanism that is atypical in our participants people with Asperger that can perhaps explain what happens in the lab and perhaps, with some belief, explain also why they have difficulties or why some people have difficulties in automatic, intuitive theory of mind. This guy could understand when he was pushed to reason about it, but not intuitively. And I start from a very different perspective, and this is a task we've been studying a lot. The simplest, almost the simplest one could think about. I studied it in the context of dyslexia. I will not talk about it today. This is it. But it's not this is it, because what we study, and we ask people, pum pum, which tone had a higher pitch? Which tone sounded higher to you? Right, the second tone was higher, thank you. So the second tone had a higher pitch, but what we really are interested in is how the previous tones that I will not have time now to demonstrate to you. So we ask a series of 100 pairs of tones, pum pum, pum pum, pum pum, pum pum. And of course, there's differences are challenging. If you're very successful, some intervals will not be challenging. Some pum pum. This was not very challenging. Intervals will be more. And then in the challenging cases, what people do, even though they're not aware of that, is their decision of pum pum, which tone is higher, is affected by the previous trials that we introduced. If the previous trials tended to be lower, they would remember the first tone in this pair, pum pum, as lower. If the first tone is really lower, it will help them perform better. If the first tone was really higher and they remember it lower, it will interfere with their performance. And we can calculate the pattern of this effect, the pattern of their effect by previous trials. What we generally find, initially this was a collaboration with Jonathan Levinstein, that is a computational guy in LSEC, and with a common, very competent student who chose to not to remain in academia, to my disappointment. But together what we found is that we could calculate how previous events affected your performance. The most recent events, one trial earlier was the most effective, but also all the rest were also effective. So what we find is that people are, which makes sense because our current experience in the world is not very informative. Our perception is very noisy. So how do we improve our performance? By introducing our expectations. It's very implicit. We are not aware of it. We think we hear, we compare. But what we compare to is our memory. And our memory is really affected by our memories, like all our experiences affect our perception. And the difference in the autistic population, I'm showing just the essence, but the more complex calculation was the consequence of collaboration with Manish Sahani from Gatsby computational unit, and with a student, Vincent Adam from Gatsby, Itai Lido, who was completed works in Entel, to my disappointment, now really disappointment. But they were really fascinated and designed a very sophisticated statistical analysis of what affected their responses to a seemingly naive perceptual task. And the main difference between people with autism and people in the green and people who are controlled was in the effect of the last trial. Pum, 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 pum. The last trial had a smaller effect. How much is the effect? Whereas all the rest, for which you have a lot of time to learn, a lot of minutes, had the same effect. So people with autism who were less affected in their judgment of a seemingly very naive test, perceptual test, compared with controls. And we interpreted it as a slow update. What does it mean? Their prediction regarding the incoming stimulus, in our case, pum, pum, is updated based on their experience, like everybody else, but this update is slower. So the most recent event hardly affects their performance. It will affect with time because we know they aggregate this information, but it acts slower. So what? So what we suggest is that, first, that I will probably not have time to show you, but this update process, here it's perceptual, we think it's cognitive, we think it's also motor, we tested motor aspect. It's generally slower. So this says first they have a deficit, which is not in a social context. It's not about other people's representation. It's about pum-pum. It's about updating slowly. So it's not essentially social, but it will be most disruptive in social situations. Why? Because social situations require you to update what your plans are online. If you do like that, I'm happy, and I kind of, and if you do what? As I speak, I will speak slower. I have to update my plans as we go. This is what online interaction is about, both in the motor and in the social and in the perceptual domain. But in the motor domain, well, not so much if you're in Facebook. There's lots of communities which are proud Asperger, active communities in Facebook, but then you don't have to respond online. You don't have to integrate all these implicit processes whereby you come to the experimenter and talk to him about all the things that you are interested in. Experimenter often is not. It's kind of, and you keep on talking. You're not integrating these gestures that are automatic and not explicit into changing your motor plans because you update them slower. Okay. Can we show this also in the brain? Can we find the correlate? Is it affecting really also perceptual regions? And for that we used ERPs. ERP stands for this is me in the dark. This is, we put this cap. We have electrodes going from these points, and we look at small changes, microvolt changes in brain activity. We don't have good spatial resolution, but we have just the adequate, fast neural temporal dynamics. And the question is, and here is where I want you to think with me. It's not fair because I have lots of time to think about it, and I'm going to make it very short here. How can we measure in this task or in a related context whether the rate of updating temporal predictions is reduced in autism? And this is a task that we did. We did 2 follow-up experiments. And the question is, how can you test it? What would be the design of an experiment that is aimed to ask this question? And this was a question that was studied by Yarden Weiss, who is an ERSEC student, and Nate Tsuk, who was a postdoc, who was a joint postdoc between our lab and Gatsby Institute in UCL. And they reasoned in the following way. So you can ask me if you want, okay? We want to know if people have a good prediction about the timing of an event. Okay, we make a very general statement. So how can we know if you have a good prediction? Because the brain is adapting. When everything is fully predictable, the response to a stimulus is decreased. When you're surprised, the response is larger, which makes a lot of sense because if there's no new information, why should we bother in spending energy in responding? When we have good prediction, the response is smaller. So we can judge by the magnitude of reduction, adaptation, magnitude of reduction in the ERP, in the brain responses, whether people predicted when a stimulus will come. So suppose we use a simple scenario, fixed rate, jump, 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 jump. This was about 1 second. Every 1 second there is a stimulus. Can we predict when a stimulus will come? Of course. I mean, we may be surprised when there is changes, but after a series that is very fixed, well, let's say by the 4th response, by the 4th stimulus, we'll have small response because we can fully predict. But then, can it tell us the difference between people with autism and people without autism? Our hypothesis says that when everything is fixed, you don't have to update anything, everybody will adapt. Okay? So it's not discriminating between the populations. We'll have large, quick. Now, when there is random rate, random is always within a range, but let's assume it's fully random. So the intervals are like that. What do you expect your, let's say, typical brain to predict? Typical brains realize very quickly that prediction is not so reliable. So there's not much weight on prediction, and there's not typically not much adaptation when these things are random. Well, we can tell very little about the world. Let's not spend energy about false predictions. So what can we do? We want something that on the one hand you can predict as of a specific moment in time. We can say when you can predict, and we want to have it repeated many times, because if you have a one-time event, as experimenters, our signal to noise ratio based on one event that is a surprise doesn't take us a long way. We need to have lots of repetition. So we need to have something that on the one hand you don't know, now you know, and you can reproduce it many times. Unfair to ask you, but I will. Maybe we'll come up with an idea that we didn't, but any suggestions for how to play with these intervals? Look at that. Here is what we came up with. So we have 3 types of blocks. They all are with a fixed interval. Okay? This is half a second interval between stimuli. This is 1 second interval between stimuli. And this is 1.5. So each of them has a fixed interval. Suppose you were exposed to these stimuli, to these blocks a lot of times, you understand, okay, that these are because you have been exposed to each of them. Now the main question is, can you tell which block is about to come? And what we have done, it's very simple, embarrassingly simple, but nobody had this, maybe because people didn't think about it, this arrangement. So we had fixed blocks, each of them presented many times, but they were presented in a random order. What does it mean? That after a while, few blocks, you understand that the blocks, whether explicitly or just implicitly, so if you hear the first tone, can you tell when the next tone is about to come?
No.
No. And if the next tone comes after half a second, you are surprised, because only the times it comes after half a second, because only 1/3 of the blocks is like that. But what after the second tone? Can you tell when is the next tone about to come? Yes. So we have a specific point in time where we know that if participants learn to use all the information they can, they will know, they will update their prediction to have a step function in the response between this one, which is surprising, and this one, okay? And we expect controls, if they're very efficient, to be able to decrease their response after the second tone to the third, whereas for autistics, we think it will be a more gradual process because they can't update their predictions sufficiently quickly. I would not have been describing it so happily had I not known what we found. And so just to go with it, it's fast forward with our results. So this is the average result of a group of 35 participants. Blue is our control. This means this is tone presented. This is a response we know comes from the auditory cortex, the trough and the pick, and this is a surprise thing. Why surprise? Because it's the first tone after a long interval, after 10 to 15 seconds, and then the second tone comes. There's no decrease. Now the question is, what will happen with the third tone? Aha. Okay, the most intense, yeah, sure.
Is there no way that this is just linked with their perception of time? Or does this say that everyone that has an issue with rhythm?
It's a brilliant question. We had a follow-up experiment that is aimed to answer this question in 2 minutes.
Okay.
2 minutes. I hope I get to the very limited time. So, this is a jump, and we see it, and then once you know, you know, whereas in the autistic population, everything is much more gradual, okay? So they cannot update. And following your question, so this is like when there is this jump, following your question, maybe they simply cannot respond quickly. How can you address this question? In a follow-up experiment performed, this is me fast forward, in a follow-up experiment performed by these 2 postdocs, we asked this question. So we used the same blocks, but rather than mixing them in a random way, we used 24 blocks here, 24 blocks here. So it's going to be the same, but the context promises that everybody can tell before the first tone what will be the interval. Because if the previous block had half a second interval, then the next block and the next block, they're all clustered. It's the same blocks, but you're not surprised. If they can adapt quickly, when they know in advance and they don't have to have quick update, we'll have the same pattern of response in both groups. And we do. This is controls, so they update by the second. They don't know exactly when the first is, but once there is the second, they already know because the previous and previous and previous were like that. And here, we find exactly the same pattern of autistic. So it's not that they can't adapt quickly when they know they need to adapt, but they have to know they need to adapt. It's a very different pattern of adaptation in time, which indicates that context, the broader context, matters. In Vishnu's, who is the postdoc who studied this, it was very communicating with her experience, and this is, she said, when I unexpectedly talk to participants with ANT, they don't relate to my questions. But when I tell them, you know, in a minute or so, I'm about to ask you questions, and then they relate. They have the time to prepare. They need more time to prepare for her questions, and they're very attentive, but not, they can't update to changes in their plans that are not. I will just want to end with one slide. Can it relate to theory of mind? Can this kind of results also explain theory of minds? It's a challenge, okay? I'm not sure it's bad. I have only 1 minute to explain why I think it's the same. We can explain both seemingly very, very different manifestations with one account. And the account is that, let's start with my experiment, and there are 3 types of blocks. In order to be quick when each of these blocks matters, we need to keep in our mind 3 types of blocks at the same time, because we need to decide after the second tone which of the different scenarios that we hold in mind in the same time is the one that we are applying now. Is it this one? This is something that we need to do. For them to be quick, they have to keep this option in mind because they know it's fixed, they know it's this interval, and they can, sorry, depending on the interval, choose. This, I think, is what happens, and I think autistics cannot hold each of these sub-scenarios, sub-regularities in parallel, sort of to build an in-depth representation of these different scenarios, and they can pick once they choose very quickly. If they don't have them at the same time, they cannot switch quickly. I think this is what can happen in the Sally-Ann condition. Typically people, they see Sally and Anne, and they can, once she leaves the room, they can have separate representations for Sally's state of mind, for Anne's state of mind, and once they have separate representations, they can tell them apart. Here too, I think they have a difficulty in forming separate representations, in building a deeper layer for explaining complex context. When the context is simple and there's just one thing that you need to remember, they do very well. When the context of the statistics is complex, what people do, I think, is they keep several types of regularities in parallel. They build another representation, and if they do, they can retrieve the relevant one quickly. I would just say one sentence, and then if I have time, I answer here. If not, I can answer in the break. So I think a common account may be the case that they have difficulties in forming in-depth representations of complex sub-regularities in a context, and hence they have difficulties in keeping rich representation of complex contexts, and these contexts, whether they are social or they're just regularities, in both cases they have difficulties. Had they had more time, I could have shown that similar accounts can apply for the often atypical motor behavior, sensomotor behavior, difficulties in synchronizing, which is a bonding experience we should have. Dancing together is a very bonding experience. The same account can explain why they have difficulties in sensory motor synchronization. And this is roughly it. Thank you.
What happens in the brain when we do that? Are we actually fixing the typical areas, or are we bypassing them and using some other functions of the brain.
I want to unpack your question to several assumptions that I do not agree with. One is that in order to be effective, we need to understand what's going on in the brain. It's not obvious. I mean, there's lots of unrelated, not specifically to autism, things that we don't directly know what exactly is going on in the brain, but we have a very effective, we can describe with metaphors, but we don't know exactly. So this is, it's a separate issue to what extent we understand. And I come to autism from studying learning. I really am interested in skill acquisition, and this is why part of my believing that difficulties in autism also have to do with reduced experience of people who need more experience to, like, when I go to a different culture, I feel autistic because I'm unfamiliar with the rules, I do it my way, and this is part of the problem with clinicians. They also are used to some cultural things, and they're biased by their own culture. Can we change it in a broader way? I think that the more proper and more valid way of communicating is like accommodating virtual environment to be more in line with the difficulties, so that in specific times you want to introduce a break. It was interesting that in the example I gave you, in the virtual example I gave you, when she really wanted the guy to follow up, she also took longer breaks. We also, for example, we tried to see what the humor, if you introduce a longer interval before the punchline, so that people will have a longer time to come up with a prediction that will be violated. So otherwise, well, what we found, by the way, is that all people, whether autistics or not, thought it funnier when you introduced a longer interval, because things go too fast for lots of us. And because people experience virtual environments such a large part of their time, I think in many cases it's worthwhile to introduce virtual environments that take into account the limits of people. From my experience, you can train people, but training doesn't transfer, it doesn't generalize. You can train a person to almost whatever you want, but you don't change the basic dynamics of its neural system. You change the ability, and typically what our brain does is aim for success in a given task. And success in a given task is always can be attained by ways that bypass what you wanted people to learn. They do better, but not for the reasons, the general reasons, because this is probably more effective if you start very, very early on when we build our basic representations. But when we deal with people who are older, you can train them. So if you want to train behavior in a very specific context, you can do that. But don't expect a broad generalization. For this context, we are now in a position to tailor situations to be more personalized. It's not just personalized medicine. You can do personalized software that is more in line with the person's strengths and weaknesses. That's my perspective. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I had a comment and a question. But I will
you can do it after I'm here.
My comment first is for this beautiful audience. I would like to mention a book which comes to mind listening to you, called Thinking Slow and Fast. The author is called Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner and professor at the Hebrew University. He passed away a few months ago, and I had the honor to be one of his friends. And I'm sure that everyone in the audience will be delighted to read his book. He has several books. And thinking about time is a fundamental problem, as we know, in any discipline. Now, my second quick question is, when you show these frightening numbers in terms of the ratio climbing up fairly fast in the scale of humankind, did anyone make the experiment of looking at a population, let's say, of yuppies in New York, where every single couple is asking themselves whether their child is in the spectrum or a less evaluated situation where people with maybe there are many more autistic children, but they are not diagnosed. That was one of my questions I had. Like the population where you measure the sample, is your result sample independent, or was it made on a given population?
Well, in general, atypical developmental states are, of course, diagnosed more with a higher percentage in affluent populations. So when you look at places in Israel, the highest doing socioeconomically have the highest rate of everything, like half. One would say, is it atypical if about half of the population has it? So a lot of it is about awareness, over-awareness, compared to people going under the radar in different populations. So yes, it's very clear. What's happening in Israel and in other states is that gradually there's also an increase in other populations, like in Orthodox population, who hasn't shown this increase 25 years ago. In Arab population, there's also an increase. And what I didn't get to is that we've just applied for a follow-up for a ERC grant, which is an applied grant. We have a task that I didn't get to, which is how quickly you do motor update. And we think this task, it's very, very correlated with whether you are slow in other tasks, but it's very easy to measure in a few minutes, and it's not biased by who are your parents, what is your gender, and all these things. So we can measure in a very systematic way across cultures and across time. Is there an increase in the prevalence of, because it's not related to anything you directly learn in any of the, so we will be probably able to answer this question in a more unbiased way in a couple of years. But currently, no, it's just as you hypothesized. Last question, or?
Yeah, last question, and then 10 minutes break because we are really starting to push.
It's a very short question, and it's quite close to David's question. It's really, last year we saw the brain effect for Alzheimer's disease, and you see that the gray cells are diminishing. In the situation of
there's no brain marker. There's no brain marker.
So there's no brain marker.
We have some active markers, which I didn't get to, but there's no morphology that is associated. There's no brain morphology that is associated with autism.
That we know. Yeah. There might be.
Right. Brain morphologies that we are aware of, that I'm aware of, that anybody is aware of.
The issue is that you cannot see, if you take two pictures of two brains, you will not be able to tell which one has the issue.
Right. That's part of the problem, and it's not obvious that it's that there is a common region. There's definitely no clear anatomical, morphological marker. We currently, we're not the only ones, of course, are currently on functional brain markers. I didn't get to talk about it. They are not 100% reliable. But it's a field in its development. It's a huge variability. That's part of the problem.
There's no information? You don't see any information?
When you say information, you mean, can we evaluate? The short answer is no.
Let's continue. I mean, Merav is here for the whole 2 days. We don't see on the brain. Let's take only 10 minutes break.
Thank you.